Today's video review is going to be about Shadow of the Erdtree. I've actually crossed 200 hours in Elden Ring between my playthrough on the vanilla game and then jumping into and finally completing all the DLC, all the side stuff, got all the cool new items, all that stuff. So lots and lots and lots of time with this game. Before I get into the review today, though, please do me a favor. And if you like what you see, please consider subscribing to the channel. Now, I'm not going to be getting into spoilers because honestly, the Elden Ring plot is very, very convoluted. And there are much better people than me who can walk you through everything you're about to see and do and explore in this area. But what I will say is that after watching a lot of said videos, it does actually fit very nicely into the original narrative of the game without ruining anything. It just amplifies what we already saw and what we already know, and it's good for that. DLC falls into two very different camps. The first being, let's try something radically different and wild and new. And the other type being, we're going to give you more of the same. Now, in the first example, like I said, you have games like Infamous, where the DLC was some weird tale about vampires and demons, and it took place in a totally different area of the world. The powers were different. They were blood-based powers instead of lightning-based powers. And the developers just had fun with this kind of weird Elseworld tale. I think the original Red Dead Redemption Undead Nightmare also falls under this too, right? Just let's do something crazy and different. However, that isn't to discount the other way of doing DLC, just giving you more of the same, which is exactly what they did here in Shadow of the Erdtree. And I think the formula really does work. If you liked the original take of Elden Ring and you wanted more, which honestly, there's still stuff I'm sure I haven't found in the base game, by the way. But if you wanted more of that, or maybe a little bit more refinement in that, well, you've come to the right place. This DLC is definitely a premium price point. It is easily 50 plus hours of content. And I'm not just talking about the thousands of times you're going to just run into the first boss over and over and over and die. I'm just talking about so many different things to see and do, so many different variable dungeons to explore, and wild different maps and areas to check out. But the core concept remains the same. It is insanely, punishingly difficult combat that is going to require you to be on your best game. Now, thankfully, since you are coming into this DLC, probably over level 100, it shouldn't be so hard for you to jump into, but it is not standalone in the sense that you couldn't just roll a fresh tune and just run right in. You're going to have to work your way up through the ranks and get to a certain point in the regular game, which will then teleport you over to this new area. And I like that because you're not coming in and just, it's a continuation. You can jump back and forth between the two. So you still have this sense of ownership of your character. I remember playing through some of the Batman Arkham Asylum DLC stuff and all the Arkham games, not just Asylum. And they would just basically put you and say, oh, you have all your gear now, you're high level, just here's a new thing to go do. Here I felt much more connected to my character because I felt like I earned what I had. The play style that I used, that I enjoyed, I was able to continue if I wanted, but they gave you more of that. They added new types of talismans that would change how base skills worked. They added new weapons. They added in new items that really could enhance and really throw the game into a new format and really a new style of gameplay while still keeping it fresh, but simultaneously keeping it very similar. And what I really, really like is that these builds that were in the original game do absolutely work in the DLC. To prevent you from over-leveling in the DLC or from being too powerful too quickly, they've added a debuff inside the DLC that actually hurts your character. And you have to go around and explore the map and collect these fragments to kind of make yourself whole. So even if you're, a level 999 character coming in from the base game to the DLC, you are still going to get absolutely demolished on the very first enemy you face until you get these fragments, which are scattered all around the world, hidden in great places, sometimes out in the open, rewards for beating bosses, rewards for going off the beaten path, for finding miscellaneous dungeons to do. They're all over the place. There's a lot of them to collect. And I thought this was a really clever way of taking a game that people have invested so much time into and still making it challenging. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the final boss and even a few areas before the final boss, just kind of those gauntlet phases you're running from fire to fire, were some of the hardest content I have ever played in any SoulsBorne game ever. It was just very difficult. And it didn't let up, and it got harder and harder and harder. And I liked it for that because, like I said, it does challenge you, and it makes you take what you know of the core game, those core mechanics, and it really challenges and raises the ceiling to make them more difficult. And that was fun. Now, if the difficulty is too hard for you, well, the infamous phrase, get good. Thankfully, because of the way the DLC is structured, and the fact that there's not a ton of gating, there's only 2 specific areas I can think of that you absolutely have to do in order to proceed, that have to be done in a specific order because they're locked, because you have to go fight a boss to get something to open up another area. I can think of where that happens twice. But the rest of it is totally up to you. And it's not like, if you get into an area where you shouldn't be, you're going to get hit and one-shotted. I mean, there are hard enemies everywhere. And it's going to take a while for you to kind of just accept that, hey, maybe I'm not strong enough and come back later isn't a viable excuse anymore. It's more of just, hey, this is where I need to be, and I'm just going to have to learn to play better, time my dodge rolls better, maybe respect my character by giving myself better armor or better shield, or investing more in magic spells, or co-op with a friend who can help me out a little bit. These are things you're going to have to learn to do in order to be successful, and I like that. But that said, it is a very long and windy and convoluted map, and there are so many times when you're going to be standing somewhere and you're going to think, oh, I want to go over to this place. And it's not just as simple as walking down a cliff. It's areas that you're going to see in the first minutes of the game that you won't get to until the final hours of the DLC, because it is so twisting and turning and convoluted. And you'll go into a side dungeon that you think is just one of those traditional gales, where you'll get to the end, you'll fight a boss, you'll get some sort of weapon or weapon art or a fragment, and you'll be teleported back to the beginning. And it turns out that those same dungeons are actually gateways to new areas of the map, which will twist and turn and loop around upon themselves. And it was so fun and rewarding, and at times overwhelming, but in a good way, of trying to figure out exactly where you were supposed to be and exactly how to get there. And the exploration in this was, bar none, the best I've ever had. And it takes that looping design of a SoulsBorne game and it puts it on its head. And I really appreciated it for that. Now, I know a lot of people, at least some of the criticisms I have seen, talk a lot about people saying how frustrated they were because they were like, oh man, I don't know where to go. I'm constantly looking at YouTube. I'm getting lost. I'm getting frustrated. And I would just say that never once did I ever have to rely on anything other than just exploring every nook and cranny. Those sometimes you're in a game and you find this little jut. Let's say you're like on a cliffside, right? And you see just a little tiny jut sticking out and you're like, ooh, I wonder if I could jump down there if there's some sort of treasure. And you're like looking at it and you're like, this is probably just a geometry artifact of the level design, and you skip it. And then you come back a couple hours later and you realize that that is actually the last place you haven't explored yet. And when you jump down there, guess what? it's where you're actually supposed to go. So attention to detail in this game is phenomenal, and it really will help your playstyle significantly, knowing where to look and when and finding all those little nooks and crannies. But if you're somebody who wants these giant, like Skyrim-esque waypoints, go to this thing here, do this DLC is not for you. And I could see where people could get frustrated because it is overwhelming at times. But because I was having so much fun enjoying the experience and finding and trying out some of the new DLC weapons and weapon types and spells, it didn't bother me too much. I was always excited to see what was next. Builds that I came into, and from the original build I came into, did last me a very long time. I just decided I was ready for a change, so I did respec. I would say my biggest criticism of the DLC is that they did not do some quality of life stuff that I was kind of hoping for. And the one that comes to mind the most is the larval tier, the one that allows you to respec your character. Those are still a finite item in this game. And because of the amount of new pieces of gear and weapons that you're going to find that do radically change how you play, you're going to be limited in what you get to choose. You can't just pick up every single weapon and use it. And I think that might come as a discouragement to some. Yes, the weapons and the armor and all those things are the way the story is told, particularly reading through the item descriptions and a lot of the environmental design. So it is nice to have that to fill in the gaps of the story. However, you can't sit here and tell me that when you get this really cool katana that looks like it's plucked right out of outer space and it's like almost dripping with starlight and it looks like a black hole. You can't tell me that you don't want to use that weapon at least once, only to find you don't have the right requirements for the build and the weapon isn't going to be as useful as your tried and true sword that you've been using for the last 100 plus hours. And because of the limitation of the respec, you're going to have to put it in your box and say, well, I'll get to it in New Game Plus. Now, I fully intend to play New Game Plus in this game, and I was actually really close to doing it before the DLC came out. I obviously paused, but I will be going back and playing through everything again, continuing to refine and try different builds and figuring out what I like that works best for me and my new play style, which has morphed greatly since the beginning of this DLC. But I'm very excited to go and challenge some of those New Game Plus bosses with some new gear that I have, with a refinement on some of the skills that I have learned, and seeing just how different the experience is for me the second time as it is to the first. Lastly, the other thing that I did actually grow to appreciate, although I was a little frustrated at the beginning, was how the story is paced. You're going to come across some very headstrong NPCs very quickly, and there are some things that happen in the duration of the story that don't make a whole lot of sense when they happen, but just stick with it. They will ultimately resolve themselves, and any of the questions you had about the characters that you meet with and the motivations that they have will ultimately be revealed. With the exception of two I can think of specifically, the quest design is a little odd, and by progressing certain characters' quest lines, you will unfortunately close out others, which will limit you from some of the rewards and some of the story beats that they get. So again, almost designed for a new playthrough, even if you didn't know. Some of the decisions aren't so black and white. When you're just randomly exploring an area and you find an item, and then 4 or 5 hours later, a character unrelated to anything you saw asks for the item, you might think, oh, great, I was able to explore and now I'm ready to be rewarded. Give me that cool item. And you're going to find that, well, there's actually another item out there that you might not have found quite yet, and you just locked yourself out of something without really knowing it. So play through this DLC with confidence that it's designed well, but it's not perfect. I don't want there to be a hand-holding in these types of games, so I appreciate that some of the decisions and some of the enemies you kill and some of the actions you take may alter your course of the game. But I think that's part of the fun, in the sense that this is a very high-risk, high-reward game style, and this is a very wild world that you're exploring that's meant to punish you, and it does constantly. It never lets up from punishing you from the beginning to the end. and I greatly appreciated it for that. I'd have to say right now, going into the end of July here, this is probably still my favorite game right now. And I haven't even beaten Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which I adore, just because I've been having so much fun with this game. And I feel like if I have 20 or 30 minutes, I'm going back in and I'm grinding for souls. I'm starting to get into some of the PvP stuff. You guys probably saw my Elden Ring build that I did. I will do an updated one here soon with my new character type, but I'm constantly drawn back into this universe, and I love it. And I think you will too. So if you haven't yet checked out the base Elden Ring or the DLC, this is a great time to jump in. There are so many new guides and so many new theory crafting videos, not just on the plot and the lore, which is amazing, but also on some really tricky builds that use very specific items together to create some really wild effects. And it's a kind of a wild west right now. Even though the DLC has been out now for some time, I'm still seeing new videos pop up every day of people finding different ways to defeat enemies quickly, or shortcuts, or hidden items that we have not yet explored. So if you want to be on that cutting edge of, the Elden Ring scene, this is a great time to jump in. But that'll wrap up today's video review. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like I said, subscribe for more good stuff, because I have some really good videos coming out later this week that I'm particularly proud of, and I hope you stick around to see them. Thank you guys again. Take care of yourselves, and until next time, I will see you guys on the other side.